everyone, thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Julia Honigsberger and I'm a Principal Consultant with Thorogood Associates. And over the last few years, my focus has been really on helping customers overcome some of the many challenges associated with planning and business modelling. In today's session, I'm going to look at a common situation that I suspect will sound familiar to lots of you. And then I'll talk about how I've seen Anaplan overcome the sort of issues that it sets up. And I'm going to talk about my top 10 features that really help to overcome these challenges. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Thorogood, I'll just finish with a short explanation of who we are and what we do. So here's the challenge. Everyone loves Excel. It's easy to use, it's pretty flexible to do just about anything you want, and because everybody's got access to it, it's easy to share workbooks with colleagues. And unlike other reporting tools, you can type numbers into it, so it's great for planning and scenario modelling and other sorts of analysis. So what's the problem? Well, I'm sure you've seen many examples where a bright idea started off by a business user looking to get a quick answer to his problem, or even a task given to a new grad or an intern, then starts to get real attention and the workbook starts flying around the department. But of course, it doesn't quite fit everyone's needs. So it starts to get extended, maybe not in the best way or not fully meeting the needs of all of these users. But before you know it, this workbook's become a mission-critical application, which after a while is starting to really creak at the seams. So some of the undesirable effects include things like real version control problems with copies everywhere, something that through change on change becomes very difficult to maintain, something that's starting to outgrow the capabilities of Excel and it's starting to run really slowly. And then the final straw, the person who developed it and knows all the issues and wrinkles needed to maintain it leaves, and no one knows how to keep the thing going. So is there a better solution? I've seen a number of customers in this situation, and Annaplan's proved to be a really good solution. It's a cloud-based planning and modelling technology, so it's software as a service really. It's pretty scalable and it can cope with huge applications going into many tens of gigabytes. But it's also pretty effective at the smaller end of the scale, overcoming those Excel challenges and those undesirable effects we saw. I'm going to spend the next 20-odd minutes talking through 10 of the features that I think make Annaplan a really great tool for sorting out these sort of challenges. So we're going to be looking at the model map, Annaplan's multidimensionality, ease of maintenance, its support for history and audit, its top-down, bottom-up data entry, a couple of areas around access and workflow, some really neat copy functions, and how you can use Anaplan to really help understand what's going on within your model. And finally, I'll talk a bit about the scalability of Anaplan. So at this point, I'm going to tab over into a browser, and now I'm in Anaplan. This is a gap financial model and reporting application that we've developed, but I'm going to use it just to show the features that I'm covering today. And I'm also logged in as a developer, and that means that I can actually see all of the items and objects within my model. And we can see that I've got quite a few modules. Now, a module is probably the equivalent of either a spreadsheet or even a workbook. And you can see that in this particular model, I've got a lot of reports in here. And from the beginning, it would be quite hard for somebody who didn't understand the application really to understand what was going on. So for my first feature, if I click here on Model Map, Annaplan is going to draw for me a sort of diagram of how the whole model fits together. It's pretty big, so what I can do is I can collapse it down to something a lot more readable. And what I've done as a developer is I've put all of effectively my worksheets into different functional areas. And each one of these large boxes is a functional area. If I click on a functional area, and the screen's gone a bit big, so I'm just going to scale it down a bit so we can get my whole functional area on the screen. We can see that a particular function area, this is all of my forms within my gap model, are linked to each other and it shows you the relationship. So for any one of these boxes I can see not only where it takes its data from using the lines, but also which other forms it gives data to. That starts to give me a much better idea of how the whole thing hangs together. I'm going to centre on 3.2, expand a little bit more. And once I get to a certain point, Annaplan starts to tell me a little bit more about the object as well. So it tells me that this particular form or gap report is dimensioned by, or structured by, if you like, the account, company, currency, year of account, settlement currency. This is an insurance application, so settlement currency comes into play, and the period that I'm looking at. And if I want to get into that model, it's really easy to find it. I simply double-click, and Annaplan takes me straight into that report. Working with a load of Excel workbooks just wouldn't be that easy. So this takes me on to feature number 2, which is multidimensionality. Many of you will probably have worked with Excel pivot tables, but they have some major limitations, and I think the biggest one is that you just can't type numbers into a pivot table. Here, what I can do is, let's say, for example, I might want to focus on inward losses. I can pivot that, and just like a pivot table, and I can maybe swap that with one of my other lists or dimensions, reporting company. So now I can see that I can just pivot it to get the view that I want. And you can see that it's got a nice hierarchy down here. So I've got a number of subsidiary companies going into a total subsidiary and a couple of main companies going into my main companies. I don't have to worry about whether my calculation for my sum function is spreading over all the correct rows. Annaplan will handle that for me. So for feature number 3, let's see how easy it is to change the structure of the data. Oh, before I do that, let me just enter some numbers. One of the things in Annaplan is you can have two sorts of calculation, if you like. You can have a formula-based calculation, and those are shown in black, and there's a formula driving that number. It's either coming from a different spreadsheet or from other numbers within this spreadsheet. And the great thing here is that I've quite often seen workbooks in Excel where the majority of the table is formula-driven, and then somebody's just typed over a cell, so it's really hard to get a feel for where things come from. Can't do that in Annaplan. A formula affects all the cells that it has been scoped for. But the second column, and I hope you can see this on the webinar, the numbers are in blue, and any number in blue means I can type something in. So I'm just going to type in some numbers. Let's go all the way down. And you can see that Annaplan's let me type the numbers in, but it's also subtotal for subsidiaries, subtotal for main companies, and created an overall total company at the bottom. But what if one of my lists, one of my structures that my form is structured by, needs to change? So maybe subsidiary 5 is going to become a main company. If I had that in Excel, I'd have to rebuild the workbook. I've possibly got 10, 15 workbooks that all reflect that structure. In Annaplan, it's much easier. I can just have a look at that list. So this is my company list, and any form that needs that list can use it. And if I look at subsidiary 5, and I change the parent to main companies, instantly Annaplan moves that down there, and I look at my form, and I don't have to do anything. It's moved it, and it's also created the correct subtotals. Looks a bit silly called subsidiary 5, so let's go back. So I only need to do that piece of maintenance once. And now if I look at my form, and any form that uses that list, it's all been moved and all the correct consolidations have happened. For my fourth feature, I'm going to look at something in Annaplan called history, and this is really useful as an audit or to simply understand what changes have been made. Remember, I typed the numbers in, and in Excel it would have been near impossible to work out who typed what and when. But Annaplan retains a history. So if I click on a cell, and I say show history for the last 24 hours, and there's been quite a bit going on because I've been just checking this morning, but if we look at the time, 14:11, what we can see is that it knows who I am because I logged in, it knows what the value was before, and it knows what the new value is. And that audit is available for anything that I put in. Another of the great things about Annaplan is that it's multi-user. So what I've got is I've got another browser set up over here. This time, in the previous browser, in Chrome, I'm logged in as a developer, if you like, whereas in Firefox, I'm logged in as a different user and just as a, if you like, a contributor. So I can't get to that developer pane, but I can get to the same report that I was looking at. And if I pick the same measure, which I think was inward losses, I can see the numbers that were typed in. And what I can do for subsidiary 4 is change that from a 4 to, say, a 6. Back to Chrome. Just refresh that screen, and now we can see there's a 6. And again, let's have a look at the history for that. And we can start to build up. So you see, I've got a sort of pseudonym login, julia@thorogood.com. The first one was by my longer name, changing from 0 to 4, and the second change was using my pseudonym, my alter ego, changing from 4 to 6. So I can build up a great history of who's changed what. And as an administrator, one of the things I can do, let's say, for example, we've loaded in some bad data. Really, I want to take the system back to how it was maybe at 12 o'clock today before they loaded the data. And I can just click on one of these IDs that's around the 12 o'clock point, and I can restore or roll back the system and undo all of the changes that everybody's made. So that's a really good sort of fallback if you have a real problem with bad data or people have been working on the wrong principle. Go back to my report. So my number 5 feature is all around aggregations and allocations. We've already seen that I can put numbers in at the lowest level, and Annaplan's aggregated them up the hierarchies in the form. But I can also put numbers in top down. So that's a bit like goal seeking in Excel, but it's a lot easier and it's a lot more flexible. So I've entered some numbers in, 1, 2, 3, 6, and that's totaling 12. Maybe I have a target for subsidiaries of, say, 30. But I know that somebody, my alter ego's typed in that 6, and that I want to keep. So what I can do is I can say, hold that 6, I don't want that changed. But overall, I want the total for subsidiaries to be 30. What I see there is that Annaplan's broken back that total 30 and taken off the 6, so we've come to 24, and it's allocated that across any members that aren't held. If I look at the history for that particular total that I've just put in, I can see that it went from 12 to 30, and what it tells me is that it broke back and it affected 3 cells. So I can not only see individual entries, but I can understand when people have done the top-down and it's caused an allocation. In this example, it was relatively trivial. It only affected 3 cells, but if you think this is multidimensional, if I'd put that in, for example, at all years of account, all settlement currencies, etc., it starts to really multiply up, and it doesn't take long to get into an allocation affecting thousands, occasionally millions of cells. On to my number 6 for my top 10, and this is called selective access, and this is something that I think really does overcome a common issue with Excel, which is how do you distribute a spreadsheet to lots of people, all who have a single entry that they're supposed to be making, maybe entering only against subsidiary 4 or only against subsidiary 3. And I think the way that's done is often people create multiple workbooks, only limited to that particular subsidiary for that person. They email it to them, that person enters the data, they send it back, and then there's a big consolidation job to be done. Or sometimes maybe they just send the whole spreadsheet round and hope that people aren't going to type into the wrong cells. Well, in Annaplan, it's a lot easier. If I go back to my reporting company structure, I've got a little configure tab. And here, if I click this selective access enabled and apply that, that's going to mean that I can say who can see what on a selective basis. So I go to my user list, and I get 2 new columns, reporting company write and reporting company read. And I'm going to take my alter ego down here, and I'm going to say, okay, they can maybe update subsidiary 4, that's their responsibility, but just so they can check things, I'm going to give them read access to all subsidiaries, for example. And for my part, I'm this top user. I can maybe have the other subsidiaries and all the companies. And I can read everything. So now let's go back and look at my forms. For me, if I refresh that, we can now see that I don't have any access to type a number into subsidiary 4 because selective access has given that to the other user. Let's have a look what their view looks like. Let's refresh their view. So you can see they've only got access or visibility on the subsidiaries, and the only number they can type into is subsidiary 4. Actually, that's not strictly true because they can still use the top down. It will have a very simple effect in this case. If I type in not 30 but 40, I'm adding 10 on. Annaplan will say, well, you've only got access to one subsidiary, and that was subsidiary 4, so I'll give all of that share to subsidiary 4. But it does mean that top-down and bottom-up still work in exactly the same way as it did before, but it kind of honours the selective access that's been set up. So you can see that that took about 30 seconds to set up, and now I can give access to lots of users and make sure that they're only entering data into the slice that I want to give them access to. Let's go back to Chrome and my developer access. The seventh feature is kind of related to selective access in a way. I'm going to go back to my list, back to my configure tab. So there was my selective access. I'm now going to pop on workflow enabled as well. I'm going to apply that, and I'm going to get a new tab that I can look at. And it's this one here, it's the workflow tab. When I open that up and drill down, what I can see is that, because I've just set it up, nobody started anything, but it also tells me who owns each slice. So I can see, for example, that subsidiary 4 has been given to my alter ego. And I can do things like send that person a mail, and you can see it pops up saying, subsidiary 4, you haven't started it, and I can get a conversation going about how we can start to fill in this information. So when I am my alter ego, back to Firefox, I hope you're hanging in with these browsers. So this is my normal business user who only has access to subsidiary 4. If I refresh the view, they also get the workflow tab, and they can see that Julia, the other person, has got subsidiaries 1, 2, 3, and subsidiary 4 belongs to them. And if they click on it, they can choose to either say it's in progress or they can say it's complete. And when they say it's complete, and I go back to my data entry form, you'll notice that actually that 16 that previously I could type into, I can no longer type into. And that's because once I flagged it as complete, it means that no further data entry will take place, and any top-down allocations won't overwrite that number. So that's pretty useful. And if I go back to Chrome and I refresh this view, we can see that's been flagged also now as complete. Feature 8 is a quick one, but it's quite powerful. So quite often, I might want to put a stake in the ground for where I am now. Say I want to save these numbers before we continue within the cycle. In Excel, that would probably mean copying the spreadsheets, storing them away somewhere. If I ever wanted to look at differences, I'd have to then pull those old spreadsheets out. In Annaplan, it's much easier. What I can do is I can look at the versions within my model. So in this particular model, I've got 4 versions: current cycle, what I was reporting last cycle, and the end of last year, etc. But maybe I want to put a stake in the ground, so what I can do is I can create a new version. I'll call it current cycle 2019-07-02. And after that it's applied that, every single form within my model that references cycles has instantly got that available to it. You notice it's got nothing in it for the moment. All I've done is create it so far, so we're up to about 10-15 seconds. Back to my versions, what I can now use is this great feature called bulk copy. So I might have 20, 30, 40 spreadsheets within my model, but I can use bulk copy to copy what's in the current cycle into that new cycle that I've just set up. Does a check, am I sure? And within what was probably 2 or 3 seconds, it's copied over around 5.5 million cells across the whole model. Now when I go back to my form, we can see that this new version has been filled in with what I had before versus my current cycle. At the moment, they're exactly the same. If it was a very typical requirement that I wanted to compare that stake in the ground to where I am today, I might put in another version. So I'll call it CCVAR, and this time, rather than doing a bulk copy, I'm going to make it a formula so that it's dynamic all the time, and I'm going to say CCVAR is equal to the current cycle minus the stake in the ground that I set up. Now when I go back to my form, you'll see not only do I have the current cycle and the stake in the ground, but I've also got a variance slice, all black. I can't type because it's a formula, but it will be calculated all the time. So let's go back and change some of my numbers. Let's put in 10, 15, 20. Now if I go and look at that variance slice, you can see that it's calculated the variance between those two slices. So that's a great way of being able to tell when I've got differences in my model. And in fact, Annaplan's got some other ways of doing that are quite neat. One of the things I can do is, on any particular form, I can look at a variance not as an absolute number, but maybe as a percentage difference. So I can say, show me where there's a difference between my base and what I'm looking at now. And I can see here it's telling me I'm 150% up on subsidiary 1, 87 on subsidiary 2, etc. So it's a really great way of looking at variances within your model. That in Excel, I think, would have been pretty hard to do. My 9th feature is all around traceability. What I'm going to do now is open up the view as we first saw it, just because it's a little bit easier to understand traceability. So this is where in Excel we've got the trace function, but whenever I tend to use it, I get loads of arrows pointing to different cells, and I find it really quite complicated. A lot easier in Anaplan. Let's look at that final current quarter figure for inward losses. I can just right-click and drill down. And what it will do, the first thing it will do is go through any hierarchies in my model. So I can see that that particular number is made up of numbers across the company hierarchy. We've been doing a lot of work with subsidiary 4, so I'll drill into that. And at that point, Annaplan's going to start showing me formulas. It's going to say, okay, that number was made up of the current quarter value plus the reclassification value for the current quarter, and it's breaking it out. So I can start to see how that number's made up. Drill down again. And my formulas start to get maybe a little bit more complicated, but this is the Annaplan syntax. It's quite easy to read. And it says if the current quarter is quarter 1, then I'm going to just pick the final year-to-date figure. Otherwise, I'm going to pick the final year-to-date minus the final year-to-date for the previous cycle. It shows me what the Boolean test is. It's quarter 2, and therefore I'm into the second leg. And it breaks down those numbers, and it shows me the current cycle and the previous cycle. Particularly useful if you're a developer, but actually quite useful anyway for a user to understand without having to pivot, cut, slice, dice, change the view. They can drill into numbers and see where those numbers have come from. On to my final feature. So for this is a medium-sized model in Annaplan, I would say, and you can see that it's got, in total, 325 million cells. That's across all of the workbooks within my model, across all of the dimensions. So that's pretty good. We've only looked at a fraction of it today, but if you remember that model map, we had that my form 3.2 was taking data from a lot of places and it was giving data to a lot of places. And in its entirety, this model is 325 million cells, or I can find out if I click on it, that's over 2 gigabytes. And what Annaplan's done is load that data into memory so that I get pretty much the same experience whether I'm looking at a big form with lots of numbers or a small form that maybe sources its numbers from a lot of different places. It gives you a really great user experience, and it can scale to work with models well over 25, 30 gigabytes. There are Anaplan models well over 100 gigabytes. So that's something that would be pretty impossible within Excel. So that was my top 10. We looked at the model map, which really helped me get some understanding of how the model was made up and let me navigate around it rather than going to file shares and trying to find the right file. We looked at multidimensionality, which allowed me to pivot, cut and slice and dice and aggregate, but still with data entry. We saw how I could take a list, move things about, change names, and all of my forms and lists within my model will reflect that without me having to do anything else. We looked at history to see how I could have an audit trail, really, of who changed what, and also the ability to roll back in case we'd made some quite fundamental errors and I knew when I wanted to roll back to. Top-down, bottom-up allowed me to enter numbers not only at leaf level and aggregate them up, but also do some allocations with some neat holding and things like that. Selective access and workflow used together allow me to implement an application that can really control who can enter and who can see what, and also get a good view of how the workflow is going and get people contributing and sending back information on where they are in the process. I used bulk copy to really get a quick copy of a stake in the ground, or even to roll over at the end of the quarter. So that was really useful and a very easy way to see variances between my stake in the ground or my previous version and the current version. And that traceability tool allowed me to drill into numbers to get a much better feel, I think, than Excel would give me for how numbers were constructed. And we ended up seeing quite how scalable Anaplan is. My model was just over 2 gig, but you can certainly go a lot larger than that and get really excellent performance. So that's all from me today. I'll finish with a little bit about Thorogood, for those of you who don't know us. We're an independent business intelligence and analytics consultancy, and we operate in the UK, the US, South America, Singapore, and India. And our main focus is on aligning business needs and analytics with technical possibilities to make sure that our clients get the best out of technology. We cover the whole range of business intelligence and analytics activities, so we work right at the strategy end all the way through to training, maintenance and support. I hope you found the webinar useful. Unfortunately, I've used up all of the time today. My email address is on there, or you may have noticed in this webinar that you could also just use julia@thorogood.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about Annaplan. But thanks for your time today.